Hello. This is going to be a special series of Muview with Mo. I'm currently enrolled in a graduate student class called Preparing the Future Professoriate. And for that class, I've conducted an interview with four early to mid to full career professors and academics to get their perspectives on both their own career and research paths, what they see as the responsibilities within academia, and also their views in museums. This program has been divided into 5 parts. 4 parts where it's the professional development interview with each professor, and then an additional combined interview of all four professors' perspectives on museums. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. So in this segment, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Jordan Metzgar, the curator at Virginia Tech's Massey Herbarium. Hello, Jordan.
Hi, Morrison. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, glad to listen to your perspectives. Would you like to kind of start things off with a little bit of your kind of academic background and what all kind of work you've been doing up to now?
Sure. So do you want the full career thing or just the last couple of years here?
Why don't we get the full career thing since looking at your CV briefly, you've done a lot of different things and have been a lot
Okay.
of different places, so you have some nice perspectives to expound upon.
Oh, sure. So I grew up in the northeastern U.S., moved around upstate New York and northern Pennsylvania as a kid. And I was always really interested in biology. So I was always, chasing something outdoors or looking at field guides or doing little animal sticker books when I was little. So I always kind of knew that was my interest. When it came time to apply for college, I knew I wanted to be in a biology major. Finding a college was a little harder. I was a first generation college student, so it was kind of a lot of mystery to the process for me and my family. I wound up kind of accidentally visiting Cornell University in upstate New York with my family one weekend and really fell in love with it. And then I looked into the school and found that, they have this beautiful campus, but then there's also tons of biologists there and they're doing all this amazing work in all these different fields and avenues of biology. Pretty quickly became my kind of first and only choice for college. So fortunately I got in there since I didn't have much of a backup plan. It was first few years were kind of hard as far as studies go. I went from a high school with 120, 140 students in my graduating class to Cornell, which has over 20,000 students on campus. So it was a pretty big shock. It took a while to just kind of get used to college life. I knew I really wanted to do research, so I kept trying to find research opportunities. And honestly, I was a pretty terrible research student. I'd get into somebody's lab and then like I clearly wasn't interested in it, so pretty soon I'd be leaving the lab. And I switched majors a few times. It was always something biological, but biology to biological anthropology to natural resources, back to biology. And then my junior year, I kind of decided I would just give up on research. I would just focus on classes and get graduated. And then I went for a walk at the beginning of summer with some old friends of mine who were really good naturalists, basically. And while we were out on this hike, they kept pointing out all the local fern species and identifying them. I thought that was pretty neat. So I asked them to take me out again. And we went to kind of a more fern centric spot. And they showed me some more. I was taking summer classes at the time. So I spent most of the summer in this local nature preserve keying out ferns and trying to learn the different species. And very, very quickly, I became obsessed. By the end of the summer, I'd joined the American Fern Society and decided that I did want to do research and only on ferns.
I
And I
didn't even
found
know that there was an American Fern Society.
now you do. Little sneak peek to the rest of the talk here, but I'm an officer now in the American Fern Society, so I help run some of its programs, and I can tell you all about it. But yeah, I got really into it, and I found a research lab that there wasn't anybody at Cornell that worked on ferns, but there was a plant lab that needed students, so they agreed to take me and do kind of their standard project, but on ferns. So I got to do some really neat field work and lab work my junior and senior year. And I was able to go to a conference and present my research, which was really nice. I got to meet a lot of other researchers and grad students and things. And then after graduation, one of those people that I had met offered me a job. There's not a whole lot of fern labs in the US, unsurprisingly. So this was one of the very few, and it's at Duke University. So my eventual wife and I moved to Duke, and we worked in the biology department there. It was a really great job. I was a lab technician, but my boss was very encouraging and very supportive. So she let me have my own side projects. She found ways to take me along to conferences to keep presenting results and meeting people. I got to do a lot of field work opportunities. We took a number of trips to the southwestern US, especially the Sonoran Desert. We did 3 weeks in Malaysia, went to a conference
Those
in
are very
Australia.
different environments, aren't they? From
Yeah, yeah,
southwestern desert to Malaysia.
yeah. They were very
Very
different
different climate
projects.
regimes.
Yeah, yeah. The Southwestern project was for some research in the lab that focused on desert ferns. People think that since ferns need water to reproduce, they don't show up in deserts, but there's actually dozens of species there, and a lot of them have really weird reproductive methods where they're either asexual or kind of partially sexual. So we were doing a lot of research on that group. So we needed a lot of samples, and I was able to go on those trips. The Malaysia one was a little different. That was more for one of the grad students projects, and we had funding from National Geographic Society to do it more as a kind of capacity building project. So we worked with Malaysian scientists while we were there, and then there was some eventual exchanges and things where scientists came back over to Duke and things. So yeah, they were definitely very different projects, but I was felt very fortunate to be able to go on both of them.
Just as a question on the desert ferns, are they kind of seasonally quiescent in the sense that like they'll kind of shrivel up for any time except for the wet season and then rain and it's boom, sprouting and
Yeah.
spring?
Yeah, they're very much like that. It's not like a situation where they lose the leaves and then quickly regrow them. The leaves get very crispy. Some of them actually curl over, and that's kind of odd too because they curl over and show their underside to the sun, which is
Hmm.
where all the stomata are.
Yeah.
So usually plants try to avoid that so they don't lose even more water to the sun. But these ferns have, depending on the group, they have some combination of this bright powdery dust, basically a wax that makes them look silvery golden, or they have scales or hairs that basically insulate them and kind of reflect the sun off.
I
Uh,
bet that there's probably some interesting material science research to like look at how those sorts of ferns can both crinkle and wither and curl up without tearing themselves.
it would be really neat. I'm not sure. I can't think of anything I've run across like that. If there is, it'd probably be on a fern called resurrection fern that actually
Mm.
shows up in Virginia that has a lot of scales on it that help it hydrate quickly. But yeah, it's pretty dramatic. You can, for some of these trips where we didn't hit the rainy season, we would collect these dry, crispy clumps of ferns and put them in a bag in water overnight and then press them the next morning when they were suddenly lush again. So it's definitely a very quick response. But yeah, that was really neat working at Duke. And after about 3 years, every year I would kind of kick around like, do I want to apply to grad school? And I was never sure. So after about 3 years, I decided I wanted to try something outside of academia to see if that was more my interest. And there was some kind of odd coincidences again, but I ran into some high school friends of a college friend of mine who had moved to Alaska to this tiny village, and they had a job opening there for an environmental coordinator. So I applied for and got this job to run a environmental remediation program.
Oh,
So I moved to Alaska Thanksgiving that year. I think it was like 60 degrees in North Carolina, and then when I got off the plane, it was 25 below in Fairbanks. And the job was actually in Fort Yukon, which is this tiny bush village. That's the Alaskan term for a town that's off the road system. So
place you get to with a pontoon boat.
in the summer, that was one of the ways. Yeah. So basically, there were flights there, like 8 to 16 person planes that would take you there, but it was about 150 miles off the road system. So if you were brave in the summer, you could take a boat on the Yukon River to get there. Or in the winter, you could try snow machining the frozen Yukon River to get there.
Oh man.
So yeah, it was very remote, about 600 people. It was almost entirely Gwich'in Athabascan residents that lived there. So I actually worked for their tribal government running this program.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was a really neat experience, kind of a slice of life that people don't realize even exists in America anymore. But I got to watch these traditional salmon wheels that would catch salmon in the Yukon River. The moose hunt was a big part of the annual kind of rhythm. There were amazing views of the northern lights in the wintertime and things. But after about a year, it was pretty exciting, but it was so remote and so hard to live there between the 56 below and the travel access that I decided to move back to Fairbanks, Alaska, which normally is kind of the last town on the road system in Alaska. It's about 30,000 people, but it was basically like moving back to the big city. So we moved there, and I got a job at the local university. I was doing a couple lab tech jobs, one at the museum and one elsewhere in the biology department. And after about a year, I finally decided to do grad school. So I applied to do grad school there and entered the master's program at first, and then quickly switched to the PhD program. Pretty much the rest of our time in Alaska was doing my PhD. So I worked on a group of Arctic ferns. They're called Parsley Ferns, the genus Cryptogramma. They sort of look like parsley, but that was a pretty neat project. It was a group of ferns that was common in Alaska. I was doing the research through the State Museum in Fairbanks, so I wanted something with an Alaskan connection. And they also show up elsewhere in the world, basically anywhere that it's really cold. So mountaintops, alpine areas, glaciers, high latitude areas. And that was, again, a great chance to travel. We went to Australia to a conference, did field work in southwestern China, pretty close to Tibet,
Oh,
did field work in eastern Russia while we were there. So
which part of Eastern Russia?
it was Chukotka.
Okay.
So if you look at a map, the little part that's right across the Bering Strait from Alaska, it's a autonomous unit called Chukotka. It's pretty much run by the military because of Cold War legacy, with it being so close to America. But it's very sparsely populated, as you might guess. Very mostly tundra for the part we were in.
Yeah, I just asked because I have a friend who is a paleontologist in the Siberian city of Novosibirsk, and a professor of mine at UGA, he does some work in Kamchatka. So I was just trying to see if it was near either of those places.
Yeah, so kind of close to Kamchatka, but more northeast of there.
Okay.
And we weren't very close to Novosibirsk at all, but there was an emeritus curator I know who had done a lot of the scientific exchange trips for the Glasnost program in the 80s to visit colleagues in Novosibirsk, but that wasn't one that I got to make the flight to.
I am trying to weasel my way into a field trip that originally was going to be next summer, but now is a little bit more up in the air. Also in northern Russia, but northwest Russia rather than the northeast. I'm trying to finagle my way to go to the White Sea area for some of the paleontology there. Incidentally enough, it's an area known for fossil organisms that are called frondose and are kind of superficially fern-like, but are not actually ferns.
Well, they sound like they have good taste at least. But
Yeah.
it's
The White Sea assemblage, as it's called, of frondose organisms like Charnia, whatnot.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Russian paleontology is like, but it was a neat opportunity because a lot of Russian botany is kind of sequestered away because of the language barrier and political barriers. So when you look at a lot of circumboreal research that was really relevant to my group, so I would spend a lot of time looking at the literature for that. Often Russia would just be kind of a void because of that. So it was a really neat opportunity to be able to go there.
From my perspective as an Ediacaran paleontologist, so this White Sea area has some really major Ediacaran materials that are some of the most useful in the world of that kind of stuff. So there is a large body of Russian research, both in Russian and being done by Russian scientists and published in English. And so I do some research on some of the organisms from that. And there are often cases where I run into certain organisms that I'm trying to figure out stuff about, but the only literature about them is in Russian publications. So I have to reach out to some of my Russian friends to make sense of it. And some of their bibliographical formatting is also a little bit different than what I'm used to. So it's difficult at times for me to tell if I'm looking at like a conference abstract or a treatise or a Russian journal article. So.
Oh, I remember that from my dissertation. That was a huge struggle for a lot of things. That curator who did the Glasnost trips, he actually translated some things for me. But yeah, even just that basic level of information transfer was often hard because of the language barrier. Mm-hmm. We had a lot of trouble getting our specimens back too. I guess this probably won't apply to you. I think the law was specific to plant material, but a law had been passed in Russia that forbid the export of plant material. I don't think herbaria or scientific collecting was really even considered. I think they were trying to limit other things, but it was a blanket prohibition. So it wound up taking, I think, 3 years to get the material back.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know just from personally moving stuff from China here to the United States that when all I'm essentially interested in looking at are rocks and invertebrate fossils, there are far fewer hoops that I have to jump through in order to comply with international law.
Yeah, if it's not alive and it's not going to bring pests over, that definitely makes it easier, at least on the American end.
It is a little bit kind of confusing for me sometimes because a lot of my stuff is basically stuff that I found behind people's houses along the roads where, kind of everyone's living next to like a small farm plot. And so like when I fill out the customs thing, when I came back and it was like, were you on farms? And it's, do I answer yes because I was, or do I answer no because I wasn't doing farm work?
Yeah, it's like I think the spirit of the question is no, but the letter of it is yes.
Yeah.
I think we had that when we
How
came back
difficult do
to.
I want to make this for me?
Yeah. But yeah, I finished the dissertation 2016, I think. We had kids in the interim, so have two little boys, both of whom were born in Alaska. And, we had a great time in Alaska, but at that point, with all our family on the East Coast, it was getting kind of harder and harder to be there. Like anytime you needed family help, they were literally 4,000 miles away.
Yeah.
So with the
And what, 4 time zones over?
yeah. So with the kids, like just getting them to talk to their grandparents was pretty hard. And the winters they were not getting any colder, but they felt colder every year. So
They
we
crept a
decided
little bit deeper into your bones.
pretty much, yeah, pretty much that week or two of 40 below zero that Fairbanks gets every year was getting a little more tiresome. So we started looking for jobs on the East Coast and, well, actually anywhere in the lower 48, but we were lucky to see this one at Virginia Tech, and I applied here and interviewed, and I started in the spring or early summer of 2017, so a little over 3 years ago, and I've really enjoyed it here. It's kind of perfect for me. It's not in the middle of nowhere, but it's fairly rural. I really like the land grant university ethos. So I really like that part of our mission here and kind of the focus it gives the university. And I've been able to work with a lot of students here in addition to being the curator, and I've really found that pretty rewarding. So that's really become one of my favorite parts of the job, is working with undergrad researchers.
Nice, nice. And so for the listeners, in previous segment where I was talking with Shuhai, we talked about herbaria a little bit, but why don't you talk a little bit about what all a herbarium is and what all your duties as a curator of a herbarium are?
Sure. So an herbarium, just in general, is just a type of natural history museum collection. So ours is specific to preserved plants. So we have a botanical garden on campus that has live plants, but we only deal with things that have been collected. So we preserve them usually by drying. And it's basically a library of plant specimens that can be used. We have kind of three main uses: reference, education, and research. So there's a lot of reference activities that go on here. We get plant samples that are submitted from farmers across Virginia. And, speaking of that land grant university mission there, if our weed clinic at Virginia Tech can't ID them, they send them over to me, and then I figure out what they are, and the farmer can know whether he needs to take control steps or not worry about the plant or whatever.
So I assume that as part of that, you have some connections with Virginia's Extension Service?
Yeah. We work with them in a few different ways. The biggest kind of customer is the weed clinic, which is part of the extension service. So, but yeah, we work with a lot of the extension agents too, and do a lot of programs with them. So it's a nice group to work with for sure. For the education, we do kind of a variety of different things depending on the format or the age group. So we do a lot of outreach program to local youth. So those are usually in person. Sometimes they come visit the herbarium, but usually we're going to an after-school club or a library STEM club event or something where we put on a program about local plants or some aspect of plant biology. We also do a lot of work with local volunteer organizations, things like the Master Naturalists, especially, so that those groups tend to skew older, especially retirees. So we tend to get a lot of those folks that come to our events. They do a lot of service work, so we often have them on volunteer nights where we're trying to get a bunch of our specimens databased or prepared. And then on campus for that kind of college age group, we do a lot of activities with the Natural History Collections Club. So that's a student club that we helped found, I guess it was about 3 years ago, shortly after I came here. And they work with kind of all the collections on campus. So, they're doing events over in the dinosaur fossil labs. They're working with the entomology collection, vertebrate samples over in Cheatham, that sort of thing. But they do a lot of things with us. They help us staff our events for those outreach events. They come in and do tours and work nights where they help us process material, or they learn about careers or other possibilities in museums. We were doing some other things pre-COVID too that were a lot of fun. We were doing pop-up outreach events in the lobby of the building here. Some of my students, they called it VT, so
Yes, I
VTEA.
remember those.
Yeah, yeah. They'd set up a table in the lobby, and they'd pick a different, usually native plant each month, and they'd make herbal tea from it. And they'd hand out little Dixie cups of herbal tea as people walked by, and kind of hit them with a fact or two about the plant. So it was kind of a high volume, low interaction process. It was a lot of fun. We got a lot of takers for that. So that was a pretty neat one. And hopefully it'll come back once COVID's over.
I'll say I'm personally not a very big tea drinker, but I was very interested in that little outreach thing because I'm very interested in trying different kinds of tisanes and other herbal teas. So that scratched an itch of mine.
Yeah, a lot of those, it was good for me even. It was a lot of things that I'd heard of, but it was the first time I'd ever actually tried the tea. So it was neat to kind of see the diversity there. And yeah, so for the third kind of function, research, a lot of it, probably the biggest use for herbaria for research is taxonomy or plant evolution. So we do a lot of time looking at specimens or doing field work and trying to figure out if we have a new species that we discovered, or if two species should actually be combined, that kind of basic nomenclatural work. Beyond that, there's a lot of possibilities that we can do. Our samples preserve very well. Our oldest material goes back almost 200 years. Other herbaria, especially in Europe, go back over 400 years. And up to at least the century mark, it's fairly straightforward to get DNA out of our material. After that, you can switch to an ancient DNA lab approach. But any study that can be done with DNA for plants, we can usually contribute something. There's a lot of studies that actually just use the data from our plants. So there's studies where they can look at the phenology or timing of life history events for plants, and they can look at our herbarium specimens and they can say, okay, this one is in full flower, or this one's in fruit, or this one's in bud, and record the date and the latitude and longitude. And you come up with these statistical models that show you the impacts of climate change, or show you possible issues that might occur, like blueberries might bloom later than their pollinator emerges. So the blueberry harvest might get hit. So areas that do a lot of subsistence blueberry harvest might have problems with that.
I know this is a little bit different, but I know that the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, that one of their researchers, she has a very interesting project looking at all sorts of leaf fossils from the Cretaceous as a means of using like stomatal index and other analytical techniques to use the plants to determine the climate of the time that they're from. So I know you guys have a little bit of fossil material, but that's kind of not your main focus, but it is kind of interesting seeing the breadth of what all information you can get from nice archives of plants.
Yeah, it can be really helpful for that kind of paleoclimate reconstruction. For our samples, which, like you said, are mostly not fossils, it actually kind of goes the other way. We take the climate information that's already known and then use it to see what effect it's having on the plant. So you can look at plant samples over time. So you could take the same species and look at all of our material for it, and you could watch the number of stomata change on the underside of the leaf as CO2 concentrations change. There's other ones that don't involve climate too. There was a study that I'd like to recreate here with our material that I think it was out of Rhode Island, that used the specimens in the herbarium and some fresh collections to track heavy metal concentrations.
Mm-hmm.
And they were looking at things like factories closing down and environmental laws taking effect and things in their town, and seeing what impact it was actually having in nature. So these bits of information, whether it's the DNA or heavy metal concentrations, they're kind of locked away in the specimen. They're kind of in stasis or preserved. So even if the specimen's 80 years old, you can still get that information out of it.
One thing that I think is kind of interesting about herbaria is that for various historical reasons, they have a really broad set of things that can go into herbaria. Like when I was talking to Suhai earlier in this program, a lot of the Precambrian microbes that he studied are now kept in herbaria. And I know that like modern protists of all sort are kept in. And I seem to recall from a previous discussion of the history of the Massey Herbarium that Dr. Kittier Hulu, I seem to recall that he did a lot of plant and non-plant stuff that kind of formed the basis of the Massey Herbarium.
Yeah, he did a lot of very broad scale evolutionary questions. So he was frequently working on things that were across kingdoms like that. And yeah, as far as that legacy goes, we had a a curator in the 80s who his name was Orson Miller. He was a mycologist, and he wrote some of the real popular field guides to mushrooms that came out around that time. And as a result, we have about 5,000 mushroom collections, so entirely different kingdom there too.
If I should tell one of our paleontology grad students here by name of Ben Kligman, he has a very strong casual interest in mycology, and so
Yes,
I
my
should let him
student
know
was
that.
actually in touch with him because
Oh, nice, nice.
I have a student who's doing a mushroom flora. So she's inventorying all the mushrooms in Stadium Woods. So for the non-VT viewers out there, Stadium Woods is a forest on our campus that's actually an old growth forest. So it's kind of an odd thing. It's an old growth forest that's in a very heavily impacted urbanized area. So she's doing a mushroom flora of that forest, and a couple weeks ago she actually emailed him to see if he could help her with some IDs.
Nice, nice. This is one other question, but oftentimes when I think of herbaria, I think of a lot of the research done on tree core samples. And if I remember correctly, you guys don't have a lot of tree cores, but I know that that's something that herbaria do.
Yeah, we can definitely get into all kinds of different areas of plant biology, whether it's ecology or evolution or physiology like that. So our herbarium, like you mentioned earlier, we don't have many fossils. I think we literally have 5 fossil specimens, and we don't have a tree core collection, but we have about 118,000 specimens here. That actually makes us the largest herbarium in Virginia. Fortunately for us, the Smithsonian is in DC because it has 4 or 5 million. So we don't have to compete with them. But our holdings are mostly vascular plants, and it's about 110,000 or so for vascular plants, about 5,000 of those fungi. And we've been trying to grow our lichen and bryophyte collections. So bryophytes are non-vascular plants like mosses or liverworts. So those, I think the lichens are up to about 1,000, and the mosses are at 3,000 or 4,000 right now. So our collection is kind of mid-size as far as herbaria go. So things like the Smithsonian or Harvard or big collections like St. Petersburg in Russia, they have millions of specimens, and they usually have whole teams of curators and faculty and grad students and things. So if you went to a place like that and you pick some obscure Pacific island off the globe and asked to see plants from there, they'd probably have a whole aisle of material from that island. For us, we're really focused on Virginia. We've always been pretty small, usually just one curator, maybe a few students, and we can play to that strength though too. So most of our stuff is from Virginia or the surrounding area. So if you want to learn the plants of Virginia or you want to do research on the Southern Appalachians, we're a great resource. If you want to see tropical rainforest plants, we could probably find 10 or 20. So, if you're doing that kind of global research, we can fill in little bits of it. But if you're doing things that are more regional, we're really strong on those areas.
I recall that you guys have some pretty extensive collections on like hyper local endemics of like different types of plants that are only found on like 3 specific mountains in Virginia.
Yeah, we've been involved for a long time with mapping the flora of Virginia. So until the Flora of Virginia book of that name came out, I think, I don't know, less than a decade ago. Until that came out, there was no reference book for the flora of Virginia. So we had been involved with efforts to map the flora as kind of a partial substitute since I think the 1930s or 40s. Our namesake founder, A.B. Massey, that was actually one of his big interests. And my predecessor, Tom Wiebolt, spent a lot of his career on that. So yeah, we have really detailed collections, probably have every plant in Virginia here. We try to get a record of for every county it's found in as well as part of that. A lot of the mapping effort is at the county level. So yeah, we really have pretty thorough holdings for things like that, those rare plants that maybe they're super rare globally, like Peter's Mountain Mallow over in Giles County, and it just shows up on one mountaintop in the world that happens to be in Virginia. Or maybe it's something that is common in Canada and then just barely makes it down to Virginia, and we're the southern end of its range. So it's rare in Virginia, but it's not rare globally.
It's nice to kind of hear about this particular kind of institution and the work that it does. You've had an interesting career where you've filled a lot of different roles. You're a curator now, and previously you've been a research technician. And so you've had a lot of different views on several aspects of academia. And from that, how would you say you've seen kind of the changing role of the kinds of professions that you've been in during the course of your career?
Yeah, so it's been pretty big changes, I guess. I guess I've been started working in an herbarium in 2002, I guess. Would have been when I started as an undergraduate in the Cornell Herbarium. So I kind of came along right at the tail end of the DNA revolution for plant evolution research. And that was a big change where people were doing much larger studies and much more powerful studies, but there was also kind of a trend towards trying to think of how to word this. Maybe a little bit more reductionist or kind of a commodification of the specimens. So before, the standard model was that if you were doing research in this field, you would get a bunch of loans of hundreds or thousands of specimens from different herbaria, and you would spend years studying them with, microscope and things, and then you would publish some big seminal work on this genus or family or whatever that you were working on. And with DNA work, all you need to make a phylogeny or tree of life from a plant specimen is just a little section of the leaf. So maybe a little bit of leaflet the size of a fingernail. And you can do your DNA extraction and your PCR and your sequencing, and you can make these big, powerful studies that answer all kinds of questions. So there was kind of a trend that started there where the specimens were still very valuable, but in a different way. So that was kind of a shock to the system for a lot of herbaria. So you get to the point where a lot of people would request things, and normally the procedure was that since you would spend years studying these, you would identify all of them and send them back. But now, maybe it was less common, like people might be doing projects where they didn't even know how to identify the plants. So they would kind of rely on the identifications that were on them. They would sample the material and then send it back. So that was kind of a hard change for the old guard. It was also less holistic of a view. So instead of needing the specimen and spending years poring over its every detail, you could just email another herbarium and say, hey, can you send me a little leaf clipping of these 6 specimens, and take them into the lab when they arrive, you grind them up, you sequence them, and boom, you can write your paper. And
It
that,
also seems like it's more vulnerable to the quality of identification in the past, which I know from other things can often be a very spotty thing at best.
yeah, that really varies. It's kind of, so there's a lot of quality control that needs to be done. And the need kind of varies from herbarium to herbarium or from researcher to researcher. And that trend's kind of continued with this move or push to put all of our specimens online. So now most herbaria are at least partially online. So for us, that usually means getting a high resolution photograph of the specimen online and creating a database record for it. And once we're done with that, we'll try to go through and finish completing all those database records so that everything would be searchable. So you could search by latitude or longitude, or you could search by collector name or year or whatever. And that's kind of continued that trend. So now a lot of data can be grabbed just from your computer. So if you're doing a project where you're making ecological niche models, what you need are locations where people have found the plant, so latitude and longitude values. And you can do that by just going to the database and downloading a spreadsheet. The specimen never even gets jostled or looked at in this process. So you get those same, possible quality control issues with the identification and things. But then there's been a few places that have probably been shut down as a result, but there's been kind of a question that we've had to answer is, if you can put all this material online and people can use it, why do you still need to exist? So herbaria, I feel like, have really had to kind of adapt with the times. I think we've been kind of, in my personal view, a little behind libraries. Public library systems went through this where it's, well, if everything's an ebook or a PDF, like, you don't need to exist anymore. And
I will say personally, that is one small complaint that I have against Virginia Tech is I think that their university library model is a little bit over invested in digital media, in that I feel I would use it more if it were easier for me to get physical copies of things.
yeah, I'm really old, so I like looking at physical copies of things. That's my preference, instead of doing everything on a PDF viewer on my laptop, which I've noticed is definitely not what the same preference my students have. But we have little kids, so we use the county library system a lot, and it's really amazing. Like, they've really been incredibly innovative and made themselves really relevant to the community, and still stayed true to that library mission. So they have little topic bags that you can grab and check out, and you can do little investigations with your kids over the weekends. And it includes a magnifying glass and a field guide and a book about birds and all these different resources. And they actually have mobile hotspots that you can check out now. So if you're working from home with COVID, you can check out a hotspot so that you can actually get the internet in your home. So they found all these really creative ways to stay relevant. And I think herbaria and museums kind of started that process a little later, maybe, but it's been something that we've had to deal with. So we've had to find ways to make our research relevant, or when it already was relevant, to make that known and publicize it more, or do a better job of connecting with the public and educating people about our world or about plants, and justifying our existence, and why we should be funded and things.
On that topic of digitization, do you think in more recent years, and not just this current age of COVID, but kind of more broadly than that, natural history collections like yours have been encouraged to be bigger participants in citizen science through things like citizen scientist digitization of your records? Like I remember that you guys do a kind of an open house night where you guys come in and have people work on digitizing material, both from your collection and from other herbaria collections through online portals like iDigBio or other similar systems.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the iDig Bio that you mentioned, where we work with them a lot. So a lot of times they kind of sponsor events, and then we participate in them. But it's really good for us in a couple ways. It helps get people into the collection, learn we're here, and they can come in and learn about plants in the area, and then it helps us get our material online. But yeah, if you're going to do it, especially at an institution like this where we have an herbarium and we have some funding, but we're not a big behemoth like New York Botanical Garden that can just pay for things, it's kind of critical to do those efforts. So we do the citizen science transcription events. Sometimes those are in person, sometimes they're online, where we have people helping to fill in our data. We do some iNaturalist things. That Stadium Woods Mushroom Project, I'm actually going to be working with my student next week to set up a project on there where people can add their observations to her project and to her research findings. So there's a lot of ways that we've started to kind of incorporate that, and yeah, I feel like at least for a smaller place like this, it's really pretty essential to surviving.
So that's kind of where herbaria are now. What do you think kind of the future frontiers of the roles of herbaria and the responsibilities of curators are?
I mean, there's a lot of different institutions, so it kind of depends on where you're at too. Like the role of New York Botanic Gardens a little different than our role here. So a big place like that can be really valuable for international conservation efforts. So places like New York Botanic Garden or Missouri Botanical Garden, they're some of the biggest herbaria in the country, and they can support these big efforts to go in and study and catalog plants of the Amazon or of the neotropics or things, and help kind of address that knowledge gap that you need to be able to actually conserve things. And they can do a lot of kind of institutional level work where they're training scientists across Latin America or working with researchers in China to produce the Flora of China volume. So they can do a lot of kind of training or capacity building that way. So I think that for those big places, that's a really valuable service that they're doing. Locally, I mean, we do a lot of education here, and I view that as really important, whether it's teaching undergrads in my plant taxonomy course or doing outreach events in the local library. I really feel like, especially with the land grant mission we have here, that our service is an important part. So whether we're IDing samples that farmers have sent in to the weed clinic, or whether we're helping the vet school, I think those things are really important. The vet school IDs are kind of exciting. There's a toxicology lab at Virginia Tech's veterinary school on campus here. And when they get odd cases in, they send them to us.
Mm.
So one day I only got photos this time of a goat's stomach contents. I've gotten Ziploc bags with things pulled out of a dead cow's rumen. I get pictures sent from veterinarians of things a puppy ate that morning, and they can't figure out what's making it sick. So those are kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes it's after the fact, like
Well, of course it's a mixed bag. What else would you describe as
yeah. So like the goat one, the goat had already died, but the
Mm.
farmer wanted to figure out what killed it so that he could remedy that in the pasture. The veterinarian one, she had the puppy in there, and the puppy was gravely ill, and they were trying to get an ID immediately. So I was able to give the veterinarian an ID. That one was black locust.
Mm.
And then, I don't
Not
know the
just an
treatment.
absurdly expensive magic card, but clearly a very dangerous plant as well.
Yeah. To dogs, especially, I guess.
It's out of curiosity, the cow example you mentioned, I seem to recall within the past couple of years, there's some sort of new invasive weed that was toxic for cattle. Was that part of that, or am I misremembering something?
Um, Was it one that was kind of all over the news?
Yeah, yeah. I remember something vaguely about it over these past couple of years. That
Was it the giant hogweed story?
yes, yes. I was
Yeah.
going to say like Hog's Head something.
Yeah, so that one that had actually made it into the news as a threat to people. But the good news to that story is that it doesn't actually seem to be an invasive weed. It's only been
Mm,
showing up where it was intentionally planted. In the case that got it into the news cycle, it was I guess a horticultural enthusiast had planted it decades ago, and then when he passed away, the house was sold, and the new family that moved in was trying to get it ID'd.
mm.
So it's only showed up a handful of times in the state, and it hasn't been spreading at all. So it's not the sort of thing that was popping up in your local nature preserve or in a pasture. So really, it really wasn't much of a threat, which was good. If you go to colder areas like New York State, it's all over the place. But for Virginia, it wasn't much of a problem. But yeah, it was this giant hogweed that actually has sap that can become toxic. So if you walk through a stand of this or cut it down and get the sap on your arm, exposure to sunlight activates it. So the UV radiation activates it. And then these compounds can cause horrendous burns that can even last for months and give you light sensitivity issue for months or even years.
Kind of relatedly, I'd be curious to like go down to Florida sometime and see what an actual Mancunial apple looks like.
Yeah.
One of those absurdly toxic plants that do similar caustic things with their sap.
Yeah, well, we actually have one in Virginia. There's
Oh, I didn't know
so
that.
that giant hogweed, it's not much of a threat, but there's actually a native plant in the same genus, Heracleum lineatum, and it's reasonably common, especially out in the mountains out here. It's not as nasty as giant hogweed, so it doesn't, make it onto the radar that same way. But its sap does have some of that ability to burn you, and it'll show up in pastures or along hiking trails sometimes. But it's a real big, beefy plant. If you're decent with plant ID, it's not too hard to get a feel for it, but it'll actually do a little bit of that burning by sunlight.
Interesting, interesting. One thing that I wonder about for herbariums is as climate change continues and as human development continues, it's not only charismatic megafauna that are the victims of extinction, it's also a large number of plants. And every so often in the news, you hear about things like that European seed bank that are trying to preserve economically useful plants. Do you think that herbaria will be called increasingly upon to preserve seeds of endangered plants for hope of later reestablishing those populations?
We could be. It kind of depends a lot on the group for that. So most those seed banks are pretty specialized technology. So we have a small seed collection here, but it's mostly just vials of seeds that we've kept. So for some things they're probably still viable, for other things they're probably not viable. So it'd be a little more, if you go into kind of the standard or average herbarium, it'd be a little more hit or miss to be able to cultivate some of these things. But at least for some techs, it would definitely be a possibility. Some of the ways that we could contribute to those projects probably more effectively would be on the taxonomy side. So figuring out sometimes for Endangered Species Act, what qualifies as a species or a unit is very contentious. So doing that kind of work is really in our wheelhouse. Or things like determining where the plant occurs or if it's changing over time. So a lot of people come in and think that we have one sample for each plant, but we actually usually have a lot of material. For some common things, we might have a couple hundred specimens for one species. And sometimes that's duplicated over time. We could have a sample of the same species from the same forest from 50 years ago or from today, or it might be duplicated over geography. We might have the same species collected last year in West Virginia and in Virginia Beach. And those are both kind of helpful. We can look at those, and for the ones that are duplicated across time, we can see if the plant is changing. Is it blooming a month earlier and its pollinator doesn't show up yet, so it isn't able to set seed? Maybe that's why it's going extinct. Or if we look at it across its range, we might be able to say, oh, these ones in the coastal plain are showing evidence of some new beetle eating them. Or now that we look at it closely, these are actually two different species. One grows in the mountains, one grows by the ocean. So we can help with kind of framing the questions that way for those issues. One of our kind of showcase specimens is actually the last specimen of a now extinct or presumed to be extinct plant.
Mm.
It doesn't have a common name. It's a very small, unimpressive plant. It's called Micranthemum micranthomoides is the Latin name. But this specimen, don't remember off the top of my head, maybe 1941. but it's the last time it was ever observed in the wild. If you look at all the literature and collections, it seems to have been really common from Virginia up to Maine, and then nobody ever found it again. So the kind of leading hypothesis is that probably some new disease moved in and just wiped this thing out, and it was so unassuming that no one noticed for a long time. But this plant is the last record of its existence.
Kind of one more question about the roles of herbaria. You mentioned earlier that for a little while you worked in a predominantly indigenous community in Alaska. And obviously, there are long and deep traditions of horticulture and herb lore within different indigenous communities. Do you think that there is a stronger push now for herbaria to reach out to various indigenous groups to document their indigenous knowledge of different plants and record that as part of the broader mission of herbaria?
Yeah, I think so. That one's kind of more local though. It really depends on where you're at. So a lot of the tribes or First Nations or things that have these traditions, they've had a lot of bad experiences with people coming in, getting something from them, and then never coming back. So it tends to be a very, if you want to do it kind of ethically or in the kind of correct manner, you need to spend a long time. You need to work with the tribe for a long time. You need to see what they want. Do they want to share the information? What do they want out of it? Do they want to have you catalog their plants and then help them set up demonstration herb garden to teach their children? Do they want you to help make a field guide so that they can teach their children how to go out and ID these things? So it kind of depends a lot. There's no kind of standard approach other than you need to be invested in the community. So you need to be there, a familiar face, and you need to show that you're there for them and that you're interested in what they want and what they think about. So it's hard to start a project like that. If you're in a situation where you can be able to start working with a tribe in that capacity, then it's possible to do that kind of work. But if it's the type of thing where you come up with a great idea for a grant proposal and you want to jet off to this tribe halfway across the country, drop in, talk to the elders, find out what plants they use medicinally, and then you're going to come back to your lab and try to come up with a drug that you sell to Pfizer, like that's not really a great way to do it. So it's herbaria definitely can play a role in that, but it's very localized. You have to have the right person there who has the time and interest and wants to make that relationship.
Well, thank you for your perspective on both your background and the roles, the evolving roles of herbaria. So I'm glad we could have you on.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thanks for inviting me.